Let me pray before we do anything else, because it's always seems to be a good idea. And I think it's a prayer breakfast, isn't it? So that'll be good to do. Loving and gracious God, we bless you and thank you for the food we've enjoyed and for those who prepared it for us. We thank you for our fellowship and friendship together, for new friends and for old. And we pray your blessing on our time, on our conversation, on our thinking together now. Pray that you would bless us by your word and by your spirit, for Jesus' sake. Amen. It's a real joy to be with you. I tend to say that wherever I go, because it genuinely is. One of the things about a bishop is there's an awful lot of meetings, there's an awful lot of paperwork, there's an awful lot of admin, there's an awful lot of reading of stuff. And that's great, and I can do that, but the stuff that brings me to life is getting out and about and meeting people. And the kind of the wariness that I always have is where I will meet those people again and what they will remember and then recite back to me. So that's always an interesting thing being a bishop. I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of who I am and my journey and God's real part in that, because I would never have expected, I know people say this, but I would really genuinely never expected to be standing up here as a bishop. So things you need to know about me, the essentials are that I'm married to Caroline. Caroline is a doctor, she's a renal consultant and also a research professor, so she's the brains of the family. And we have 3 daughters. So my eldest daughter Emma is 19. We are just learning what it's like to have your first child go off to university, so that's a new stage for us. Our middle daughter is 16 and our youngest daughter Alice is 12. But she will remind you that she's going to be 13 in just a couple of weeks' time. She's growing up, essentially. So you'll recognise there that my life is essentially in the hands of other women. I grew up with 2 younger sisters, so it's really been the story of my life. We have a 9-year-old Labrador. He's a boy because we tried to I'm trying to redress the balance in the family. And I think I'd probably say that on a good day, I come in the rankings just above the dog, and on a bad day, I'm really somewhere way down below the dog. So that's part of where I'm from. One of my particular memories there's all sorts of wonderful things about of having children, and my daughters are brilliant, and you know, pray that they will grow up to be brilliant, godly Christian women in all they do. Alice, who is our youngest, when I was teaching her to ride a bike when she was about 4 years old, she's really mastered that whole thing of a balance bike that kids seem to have now, so that was no problem. And so as she was learning on a proper bike, I took the pedals off so she'd learn to balance on the bigger bike, and she would just freewheel herself all the way around where we lived. At that point we lived in Jesmond, just off Jesmond Dean, known for its very steep hills and banks and things. Always much better going down than trying to get back up again. And Alice has got to the point where she's really got the hang of the balancing of it. So I put the pedals back on the bike in the hope that she would quickly learn the thing about power, not just pushing your feet off the ground, but starting to pedal. Now Alice is quite industrious. She's a bit scientific. She's kind of, she loves maths. She loves all of that kind of stuff. She loves to know how things work. And so, as I was just holding the bike as she was going along, she would cycle with her hands firmly on the handlebars and looking firmly down at her feet, watching her feet whirring around, watching her feet on the pedals, trying to understand what was going on. And eventually I said, do you feel ready to give it a go without me holding on and running alongside? Because you get a bit tired after doing that for a while. And she said, yeah, I'm ready. I can do it then. So we were just along our street. It was nice and flat. There was a kind of a hill at the end, but the street where she was nice and flat. And so we set off, and Alice very quickly got into her usual position of looking down. And she said, Dad, I'm ready, you can let go. And so we'll go for it. She's kind of looking up, looking down, looking up, looking down. So we got to a point where she said, right, I'm ready, just go. And I couldn't, to be honest, couldn't keep running alongside any longer. And so she set off on her own without me holding onto the bike. Absolutely gripped onto the handlebars and suddenly as she was going along, just head back down, watching her feet on the pedals like this. And so as she was shooting off down our road, and as she was getting nearer to the hill, I shouted, "Alice, look up!" At which point she did a spectacular thing of looking down from her pedals to looking straight up into the sky. She was fine by the end of it. But I love that sense of looking up. That command to look up is one that stayed with me, because I think it's the command that you and I so often get from Scripture. Look up. Lift up your heads in the Psalms. One of those wonderful passages in Paul in Colossians in chapter 3 is, set your hearts on things above, because you're raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above. And I love that idea that we are called to look up. And part of my thinking, part of my kind of mission in life, I guess, as a bishop, as a vicar, whatever role I am, is to help people get that new perspective on what they're doing. It's absolutely right to understand how things work. But so often in life we get caught up in the detail, we get caught up in the business, and we fail to look up and see the bigger picture. We fail to look up and see what it is that Christ is calling us to, what we are part of together. And so when Donald asked me for a title, I wrestled with it, but I've called it Shepherding Sheep and Herding Cats. Essentially, because on a bad day, what I do feels like herding cats. Trying to, the Church of England is wonderful in all sorts of ways, and in others not so. But one of the wonderful things, which is also it's kind of one of its Achilles' heels, is that actually it's made up of a lot of independent units, lots of different legal entities, discrete bodies. So a PCC can just decide what it wants to do. The PCC is an own legal entity, and bishops or vicars even trying to tell a PCC what to do, that can end up in a bit of a disaster. And it's right the way through the Church of England. Everyone thinks the Archbishop of Canterbury is ultimate control. Of course he doesn't. There's 42 different dioceses all doing their own different thing, and that's part of the wonder and some of the frustration in the church, because we all get on and do what we think God is calling us to do. So on a bad day, it feels like my job is herding cats. On a good day, when I remember to look up and see what I'm called to do, it's much more about shepherding sheep and being called to lead people to follow the Good Shepherd. So that's just a by way of perspective. One of the things I want to do is just say to people, what is God calling you to do where you are? How is what you do now, whether in your work or in your retirement, where are you serving God already? Because one of my big bugbears is that often to serve God, it seems to be we have to do something in church, or it has to be ministry up front in the church, or dressed in strange things that bishops have to wear. But actually, what is it that God's calling us to be and do where we are, in our communities, in our families, in our neighbourhoods, in the places where we play or we work or we help out? I grew up in the northeast, so I was born the right side of the River Tyne in Newcastle. But my family, and my mum's family, certainly, were all from Gateshead, from the Felling in Gateshead, and so that's where the kind of first couple of years or so of my life was spent around that kind of area. My mum's family were Gateshead born and bred. My dad's family were from Lancashire, but my granddad, the vicar of Christ Church in Felling, and so his family followed people around. So there's a sense in which, well, you can see already that the ecclesiastical roots are deep. To add to that, my granddad was a vicar. His sister, my great aunt Gladys, was a missionary with the Church Mission Society in India in the 1950s. And then my dad's sister, my aunt Evelyn, was a missionary with the Church Missionary Society in Japan for 30 odd years, between 1969 and 2003. So there was a kind of a sense of church and missionary stuff was around. When we were growing up, our family moved to Chesley Street, which is now known for Durham playing cricket there. They never played cricket there when I was there. That all happened afterwards. So I grew up in Chesley Street, and that's where I started to really come to faith. So St Mary's and St Cuthbert's Parish Church would be my ascending church, my home church, if you like, where I grew up. So as a teenager, a first sense of God's calling was when I was around 17, 18. So people said, do you want to think about doing something like this more fully? At that point I didn't. I wanted to go off to university, but I thought, I wonder whether I want to give some thought to this this God stuff that people were asking me to do. So I went off to University of London and did a theology degree with religious studies, because I kind of wanted to weigh up Christian theology and world religions as well. So that was kind of what I was doing in those 3 years. And during that time, I felt a real strong sense to go forward through the ordination process in the Church of England, which can be a laborious process sometimes. I started going through that process and was recommended for training for ministry. But I thought, hang on, I've got a great aunt who was a missionary in India, and I've got my aunt who's a missionary in Japan. Maybe I just need to think about this overseas stuff. So when I finished at university, I went back to my home church in Chester Street, and I worked for them for a year. They were very kind enough to give me a job as a youth worker. Along the way there, I did some youth work in schools with Paul Revel back in the day. So that was we're both far. So that was good to do that. So Paul and I worked together in one of the local schools in Chester Street back then. And after that, I thought I just want to check out this missionary stuff. And so the church I was part of had a link with OMF, the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, which was part of the China, well, we used to be the China Inland Mission. So I read my Hudson Taylor and all that kind of stuff, and got inspired by that. But I just maybe want to see what I can do. And so the Prescotts, who were our missionary link with that church, helped me set up a link. And I went the idea was that I did a year and a half as a youth worker, supporting youth work in the church I was part of. Ironically, the youth group I led was bigger than some of the churches that I've led, but 150 from 11 to 18-year-olds part of this work, which was a real gift and a beautiful experience at the time. But I decided, I'm going to go and do something abroad with OMF, and so they arranged a 6-month bespoke placement for me. So I went to the Philippines in the 6 months before I was due to start theological college to train. So went out to the Philippines, which was an extraordinary experience in all sorts of ways. I did a month going around Filipino universities with the equivalent of UCCF, so IVCF, working in what we would not think of universities, because they were generally never had windows. You slept on the floor, or there was no high tech. This was back in 1994. Even before email had been invented and all that kind of stuff, So in order to let my mum know I'd arrived there, I had to wait for 2 weeks before I got anywhere near a phone, so she knew I was still alive. So it was quite an experience, and then I spent about 5 months in the centre of the Philippines in Metro Manila, working for the Diliman Bible Church there, and again working with young people and students and others, and just generally learning what life was like. And seeing if there was a sense of being called to overseas mission work. While I was there, I met another short-term placement she was trained to be a medic, and her name was Caroline. And so one of the extraordinary things about the Philippines was that Caroline grew up in the southwest in Bristol. That's where Caroline and I met for the first time, and then were married 2 or 3 years after that. At our wedding, my father-in-law, who likes to think he's witty, decided that OMF stood for the Overseas Marriage Fixers, rather than anything else. Anyway, Caroline's experience of being overseas, that was part of it. She was also testing out is there a missionary thing there? So she then did her elective in Lesotho in Southern Africa the next year. And our combined experience led us both to think, actually, we'll just stay where we are in the UK, because there's a call and need there, and there's less wildlife. Let's put it that way. So, I can tell you all my stories about cockroaches and all those kinds of things, but that's probably not just after breakfast. So Caroline and I got together. We lived. I trained in Cambridge, Ridley Hall in Cambridge. So did my vicar training there. Caroline was finishing her medic training in Birmingham, so that's quite convenient. And we were married during my curacy, which was in Nuneaton. I don't know if you know the Midlands at all, but I was in Nuneaton, just north of Coventry. in the Diocese of Coventry, in Warwickshire. I remember the privilege of where I was, the church I was in, was that it was this extraordinary place, the biggest churchyard in Warwickshire, so I meant lots of funerals. That was great, good training I was told at the time. But one of the wonderful things about the church I was at, All Saints Chilvers Coton, wonderful in one sense. Part of its history was that when Coventry Cathedral was bombed in the Second World War, actually All Saints Chilvers Coton was on the same bombing run, and the church was bombed at the same time as Coventry Cathedral, and the church was literally, the bomb went through the ceiling and blew out all the windows, but the walls mostly remained intact. And there was a big POW camp just outside of Coventry later on, and prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, came and helped the rebuilding of the church. And it was an extraordinary thing. And you know that now that Coventry Cathedral continues to have that sense of reconciliation and being part of its vocation and its call, as we're all called to be those who are peacemakers. And part of one of the wonderful things about All Saints Chilvers Coton, that one of the German prisoners of war was this brilliant wood carver, and so the church has got all sorts of wonderful wood carvings around it. My favourite one was on the way up to the pulpit. Just on the side of it was carved this picture of St Paul preaching. And a young man sitting in the window as Paul preached, and just started to fall who was the young man that fell in, Paul had to go down. And I just thought that was just a wonderful irony and sense of humour, that as you went up to the pulpit, every preacher had to walk past this reminder not to go on too long. I hope somebody's... Did somebody work out when we started? Yeah, you're 9:30. So all sorts of wonderful things happened in that time. I in a sense, being there for 3.5 years as a curate, where I learned the kind of the practicalities of being a priest, a deacon, a minister, a vicar in the Church of England. You might be interested to know that the curate just immediately before me had made quite a mark on the parish. And he went on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. So following in the steps of Justin Welby was a little bit of an ask, really. But we got there in the end, and he still reminds me of those days and what we share in common, which is great. After that, we were trying to weigh up, where do we go? Where is God calling us in all of this? So Caroline was from the southwest, her parents in Bristol. My family's in the northeast. The Midlands was actually quite a good place to be because you're equidistant, kind of. A diagonal line, and we tried. I tried applying for jobs in the southwest. That didn't seem to be right, and then we were invited back up to the northeast to look at a particular post which had been vacated in tragic circumstances. So I ended up going back to Durham Diocese and to Gateshead. I became the vicar of St Albans Windy Nook, which indeed is a windy nook. And they used to say in Windy Nook that the kind of the east wind from Siberia comes straight across the North Sea, because it's all flat, isn't it? Europe, there's no hills. So it comes straight across and hits the northeast, right on Windy Nook. I have to say, even on a warm summer's day, it was one of the coldest places on Earth. But a brilliant community to be part of, St Albans Windy Nook. And I was there for 7.5 years. Two of our girls were born while we were there. And one of the interesting things was, of course, I was. If you know Gateshead, you know the Felling is at the bottom of the hill, and Windy Nook is kind of near the top of the hill, on the way up the hill, near the QE Queen Elizabeth Hospital there. And because my grandfather had been the vicar at the bottom of the hill, and I was now the vicar near the top of the hill, and you know, people live their lives without paying any attention to parish boundaries. The Church of England, I can't understand it. We had this extraordinary experience that I ended up burying the same people my grandfather had either baptised or married. And so we had this extraordinary thing where people were remembering my grandfather in that time. So it was an extraordinary place to be part of that, part of the ministry in that area, and again learning what life is like in Gateshead. And then feeling a sense of where might God lead us next. And I'd always, because we like to go to the coast, we've always had dogs, and so we used to drive to Tyne. And when you drive along to Amouth along the coast road, you always go kind of under the Cradlewell bypass. And there's a church on top of it, Holy Trinity. I used to think, I'd love to be the vicar of that church. I just kind of fancy that. And it was a church that kind of seemed to suit our kind of tradition, which is informal, evangelical, Anglican. And then the opportunity came up for that post came available, but it wasn't quite at the right time for us as a family. So Caroline had just given birth to our second daughter, and both my daughter and my wife hadn't been very well following that, and that's one of those kind of tricky times in life where you're trying to weigh up what is the right thing to do, and it really felt strongly that now is not the right time to pursue something new. And so we thought, well, maybe that isn't the right time, and that isn't the right thing for us, and so we said no to that. And then, interestingly enough, probably about 8 months later, the post came back on, became available again, because they hadn't appointed in their first rounds. And so at that point, we were in a better place as a family. Health of everyone was better. And so we pursued that and ended up becoming the vicar of Holy Trinity in Jesmond, which was a great time for us as a family. I did almost 12 years there, serving there and being part of that community was very different to Gateshead. It's amazing, isn't it? How you can sometimes just travel 2 or 3 miles and life feels very different. So Gateshead was very much, in Windy Nook, it was very much an ex-mining, ex-quarrying community. Everybody knew each other. Jesmond was very much much more professional. I use that word advisedly. That's not to say other people aren't professional, but is that there's a kind of high turnover of people that are running through the place. What I did love about Holy Trinity Gateshead, Holy Trinity Newcastle in Jesmond, is when you read the history of these places, it's always interesting to read the history of the churches. It was built by stone that came from the quarry at Windy Nook. I kind of quite like those kinds of connections and about what's going on and what God might be saying in all of those things. So there's that real sense for me of being part of that community and being part of a church that was really wanting to be engaged and opened out. We used to have our little strapline was about being opened up and opened out. So opened up to God in all things. And because if we're opened up to God, then we're necessarily opened out to others. So one of the great things for me was John 7, when Jesus stands up on the last day of the feast and says, "Let anyone who's thirsty come to me and drink, and streams of living water will flow out through them." And for me, that's a kind of a picture of what it is to be a Christian in this world, that we are opened up to God and opened to the Holy Spirit. He pours into us. But that's not just for us. That's to go out into the world, and it's that sense of what God gives to us is always to be shared, and that's part of how I want to be and how I want the church to be, is that we're opened up to God in all things. But because we're opened up to God, that means inevitably we must be opened out to others, and that sense of God pouring His living water, His Holy Spirit into us, in order that we might share that and share that life and that life-giving Spirit of God into the world. So that was at Holy Trinity. During that time, right at the end of it, the Bishop of Newcastle phoned me up one day, and she said to me, "Mark, I'd like you to think about being the acting Archdeacon of Northumberland. Just for a bit, because we've got a bit of a gap, and we just need to fill that gap." So Caroline and I had to think about it and pray about that. Me and the team at Holy Trinity had to think and pray about it. And so I said yes to that, never thinking. I mean, you've probably seen all the TV programmes where archdeacons are in them, and they're never. They all seem to be quite sinister. Absolutely. Or they wear black gloves. That one in Wray. Always wears black gloves. So I never really see myself as an archdeacon. Didn't really know what an archdeacon did. And so we ended up saying yes. We'll think about it. We'll do it. And one of the interesting things for me is that we always have an idea of what these things should be like. But that's not necessarily what God has in mind. God calls us as people, and we inhabit the roles He calls us into as we are. Not that any of us are the finished product, but God is always at work in us, forming and shaping us. And there's a sense for me that taught me that actually you inhabit the role as God is calling you to be, not as somebody else is wanting you to be or thinks you should be. And that's one of the big things. Certainly in the Church of England, everyone's got an impression of what a bishop looks like, what it should be like, and everyone's got an idea of what an archdeacon should be like, and then what a vicar should be like. And I think I've tried to spend my life trying to say, actually, we can be different. One of my favourite stories, I should probably, maybe I'm going to regret saying this on something that's going to go on YouTube. One of my favourite stories, when I was a vicar in Gateshead, I used to wear, because I thought it was cool, I had a black jacket, a black leather jacket. And some days when I've done funerals, I don't always dress all in black, but I used to dress all in black. So black trousers, black shirt, dog collar, black leather jacket. And I pulled into this petrol station to fill up the car, and there was these young women filling up their car as well, and one of them got out. And bear in mind, this is Gateshead. She saw me in my black leather jacket. She said, "Eee, are you a male stripper?" Which I still like to tell that story every now and again. I am the real deal. Caroline just puts her head in her hands whenever I tell that story. But anyway, so moving on, I was an archdeacon. I was the acting Archdeacon of Northumberland. Actually, ended up being for nearly a year, and then took on the substantive role for a little bit longer after that. And then during that time, I didn't really have much chance to think to kind of get used to that role. When I was invited at that point to consider being the next Bishop of Berwick. And so that process, so I was an archdeacon for a relatively short time. What I've learned in life is, what somebody used to say to me about being a vicar, you need to stay in a place long enough to learn from your mistakes. And that what lots of clergy, they felt, what they do, they stay in a place for 5 or 6 years, make all the mistakes and then move on. But there's a sense of not learning from them. So I always was determined that I would stay in a place for at least 7 or 8 years, so I could learn from my mistakes and try and put things right. But that's the thing. So as an archdeacon, I was there for 2 years. So clearly, I made so many mistakes. I had to get out of there quick. Although I do work with my fantastic colleague, who's the new Archdeacon of Northumberland, and she's doing a great job at putting everything right. But being Bishop of Berwick has been a real what I never appreciated how the difference of sense of call. So in the Church of England, we talk about our call to be a deacon and a priest, and then we talk about our call to be a bishop. And the call to bishop is a really interesting one for me. And one of the things they were looking for in the Bishop of Berwick, because there's all the paperwork that goes out about this stuff, is there are various images from Scripture about what a bishop should be. So, and they're all scriptural images. And the two that they'd highlighted for the Bishop of Berwick was to be a shepherd and a sentinel. So it's that sentinel being the sense of the watchman on the walls, you know, in Isaiah, looking out for announcing good news, and how beautiful the feet of those who bring good news. That it's the watchman looking out for the messenger, for the herald bringing the good news. And so one of the things I feel very much an affinity to is that sense of being out there, looking for where the good news is, announcing the good news, seeing where God is at work in our parishes, in our communities, in our projects, and all the things that we are doing and announcing that. But the other thing is this sense of being shepherd. And for me, that call to be shepherd is a really significant one. It's an obvious one in many ways. But for me, it's bound up in... There's an author who I really enjoy. So an author called Ken Bailey has written an awful lot, quite technical stuff on the parables of Jesus. And Ken Bailey was a scholar who lived in the Middle East for all his working life. And he helps us understand the parables of Jesus in their Middle Eastern context and helps us to explore what actually the culture might have been saying and the way we might sometimes misread or misinterpret some of the parables. And he's written so many great things. He wrote a book all about Psalm 23 and the lost sheep, and tracing the narrative of a shepherd right the way through Scripture, which is one that I find really profound and helpful. And one of the stories he tells I love, and I'm going to probably finish with this story if that's about right. Does that seem about right? Fantastic.
A little bit longer, but it's okay.
And he tells this story of the time back in the 1930s when Palestine was occupied and part of it was under British control. And in the 1930s, there's a group of villages which had rioted against the British control, and as a punishment, all of the villagers had their animals taken off them. And everybody had either larger or smaller flocks because that was part of their livelihood. And all of these animals, goats, sheep, cows, whatever, were sequestered together, were confiscated and put in a great big pen in the centre of the village. And it was a way of asserting control. And in order to get your particular animals back, or your herd of 30 sheep or whatever it might be, you had to pay over a fine, and then you could claim back your animals. And so Ken Bailey tells this wonderful story of this British sergeant who was in control of all of these animals, and of this orphaned shepherd boy. So this orphaned shepherd boy had 6 sheep and goats. That was his little flock. And like everybody else's, they'd been confiscated and put it into this pen in the centre. And he came up, somehow he got together the money he needed to pay the fine. He went up to the sergeant in charge of the British sheep and his goats. And the British sergeant says to him, just pick any 6 animals and take them out. And the boy was like, no, I'm going to claim my 6 animals, my 6 goats and sheep. And the sergeant just poo-pooed it, because you're literally looking at a massive corral of over hundreds of animals. And this little shepherd boy got out his pipe, played his shepherd's pipe, and 6 sheep and goats trotted out. His 6 sheep and goats trotted out after him, much to the amazement of the British sergeant. I love those stories. But it speaks, doesn't it, of John 10, when Jesus says, my sheep will know me, they will recognise my voice, they will follow my voice. And for me, it speaks of that wonderful relationship of trust between shepherd and sheep. The trust that we are called to have in God as the good shepherd. I'm always struck by, in Psalm 23, you'll know it, I know you'll know it really, really well. I very often can't get past that first line. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore I will lack nothing. That's an extraordinary, just in that one verse is an extraordinary statement of faith. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore I don't need a thing. As another version of the scriptures put it. That sense that in God we have everything, all that we need. And that's a thought to leave you with. But I love that image of the shepherd boy and his sheep, that relationship of trust, that relationship of knowing. He knew he could find his sheep. His sheep knew to respond to that whistle. That sense of Jesus who knows his sheep, and his sheep hear his voice and know his voice. And for me, one of the real battles of our age, one of the real struggles in our society, one of the real struggles in our church, is this thing of trust and of knowing each other, of knowing and hearing the voice of the Good Shepherd, of those who are charged with the responsibility, the serious responsibility of being shepherds, know the people they're called to lead. And for me, that's part of the looking up to God as the Good Shepherd, but also knowing my call, that sense of what I've been entrusted with, as part of those who help shepherd God's flock. And that's a serious responsibility. You know, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd in John 10, because he was contrasting with all the really awful shepherds that had gone before. And if you read through Ezekiel, you'll hear about all the shepherds who are in it for their own gains, who don't really care about the sheep. But there's a sense of being the good shepherd is the one who knows and loves the sheep. Ultimately, of course, Christ, who gave his life for the sheep. For me, that's the fundamental call that keeps me going through all things. That's that sense of call of being called a shepherd. One of the wonderful things about being a bishop is that when you're ordained as a bishop, when you're consecrated as a bishop, they give you a staff, they give you your shepherd's crook. I should have brought mine with me today, shouldn't I really? My stick was made by Steve, who was the British stick making champion back in 2018, I think it was. And it's a beautiful horn of a ram that's piece shaped beautifully, and a reminder to me that is my call, to be shepherds and to help shepherd the flock that God has entrusted to all of us to be part of, and all of us to know the Good Shepherd, and all of us to have some sense of responsibility in caring for that flock. I've probably spoken for longer than I needed to, but I'll bring it to an end just there. But if people have questions...
They're probably a bit tight, but I'm sure we've got time for a question or two, or people can grab you afterwards.
No, absolutely. I'm not rushing away. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful talk. You may partly answer my question, but knowing the lack of human assets the Church of England have, and the criticism is made that it can be top-heavy, do you have a view on the arrangements in the Church of England?
Yes, I do. I think the reality in every denomination, in every church, is not dissimilar. So I think in the Church of England we're trying to get to grips with the fact that we are this very diffuse organisation on the ground with all of these individual entities, and trying to get the balance right between that centre. It's always the balance between the centre and the edge, and I think sometimes we don't get that right, and we could do better at it, and there needs to be better listening from both sides in that. I'm being very general in my answer too, but I do see from where I am that the real tension between the centre and what the centre does, and how the centre supports the edge, but also how the edge has a responsibility towards the centre as well. I could say more, but it could be better.
I can understand why you didn't put it.
I want my job tomorrow.
Yes.
So, probably a bit of self-interest there, isn't it? That's
Anyone else got anything which can be answered without putting your job at risk?
Yeah, sure.
Mark, was it something to do with you were the very first vicar for many, very first bishop, weren't you, in Berwick? Wasn't it since Henry VIII?
So I'm the third Bishop of Berwick in 400 and odd years. So the first one, Thomas Spark, he was 400 years ago, and then Mark Tanner was the second Bishop of Berwick in 2016, and I've been the third one in 2021. So yeah, there's not many of us. We're a rare breed. Bishop of Berwick, and seemingly we all seem to be called Mark as well. Certainly in the one area.